Welcome back. My name is Sam Hassel, and in today's episode, we are going to be reviewing yet another case study here. This is from an audience member, so the student is in 10th grade. Before we get into that, though, I wanted to just make a quick couple of announcements. So, if you would like us to do a case study episode for you as well, if you're in a younger grade or have a student in a younger grade, feel free to reach out. We're going to be doing a whole bunch of these coming up. And then also, if you are a senior or if you have a senior and you have decisions coming out with early decision, early action, etc., if you want us to do a case study episode, if you were deferred or rejected and you want us to sort of diagnose potentially what went wrong, or if you were accepted and you want us to sort of dissect what went right for you and sort of be able to share that with other people, if you're so generous, you can reach out to us. So for any case studies, just shoot us an email. That will be info@greatmindsadvising.com. We'll have it in the show notes as well. The email address again is info@greatmindsadvising.com, and we'll let you know if we're able to do a case study episode on your particular background. Okay, let's get into this. So again, this is a 10th grader in high school. Their unweighted GPA is a 3.9. Weighted GPA is a 4.01. We don't have their transcripts. We do know, however, here from the description, the student is taking the district's most advanced math curriculum, algebra trig, and pre-calculus. Will take calculus BC as an 11th grader and intervariable calc senior year. I think they meant multivariable calc. So fairly advanced math track here, taking calc BC next year, and then 12th grade MVC, multivariate calc. Unweighted GPA is a 4.0 out of 4.0. It's hard to sort of tell without the transcript exactly what the breakdown of grades is. As I've mentioned on the podcast, if you are trying to be maximally competitive for highly selective colleges, then you want to have no B's on your transcript. A GPA doesn't necessarily, unless it's a 4.0, doesn't necessarily tell us what the breakdown is of the actual grades or the courses. So we don't have that information here. In terms of the student's interests, so they put mechanical/aerospace engineering interested in possible creative writing or English minor. And we'll sort of see some of the background for this student. It is quite cool and interesting that their potential positioning here is something pretty technical and engineering based, but they also have interest in a background in creative writing. That's a potentially very cool intersection. And we'll talk a little bit more about that and maybe how to sort of intertwine the two. Then they put their goal is strongest engineering programs in the country, maybe MIT, Georgia Tech. We also love Princeton for affordability. So obviously, of course, very high goals. If you're talking about MIT, Princeton, you're talking about basically top 5 schools. You're also talking about a lot of colleges, including Georgia Tech, that are the very best in STEM and engineering. One thing that I want to remind everybody of, because a lot of people have very high goals, is once you sort of posited a very high goal for your candidacy, that then becomes the standard against which your candidacy has to be judged, right? And so highest goals sounds great in a vacuum, but highest goals also equal highest, most rigorous standards that you have to live up to and to which your candidacy has to be subjected. So in terms of the students' extracurriculars, what we're going to do in this episode, I've done this in some past episodes, some past case studies, particularly the application case studies. This student here has a whole bunch of sort of the raw, rough list of extracurriculars, but they're all over the place. What I'm going to do is read through that list on the first pass. And then the second pass, I'm actually going to do sort of the thematic reorganization based on sort of the themes that I've seen in the activities. And this is very useful as a discovery exercise. And this is typically what we do with our students, but usually with much larger chunks of information, many pages and pages of answers. But we're going to basically just rearrange all these extracurriculars into what their themes are in terms of academic interests, passions, and then we're going to go through those different categories and those different themes to sort of hopefully shed light for the student and their family on what some of these themes are that we could sort of potentially pull together into a compelling narrative. So in terms of the original list of extracurriculars, strong writer and is a part of her school's English Scholars Program. Poetry was published in 3 high school writers' publications as a 9th grader last year. Girl Scout since age 5, completed her Silver Award and is working on her Gold Award. Currently in the 2nd year of the Gold Leadership Committee. I've redacted the name of the county, but for the County Council of Girl Scouts. She won a short writing contest for a Girl Scout, with prize being Space Science Girl Scout badge that traveled on a NASA mission to the moon. They put a question here: does this matter if it was earned in middle school? We've covered this in some of the application review episodes. Typically, when you're talking about the common application or applications in general, that's going to be for high school activities only. So since the beginning of ninth grade. However, if you put it in the additional information section, there is no specification. You can sometimes just take out the years. So if you put it in the activities list, or if you put it in the honors section, well, you have to sort of check box what the grade was or what the year was. However, if you put things in the additional information section, it's much more amorphous, and so you can sort of potentially redact what grades it occurred in. It's a little bit of a hack that we've shown people sort of discussed in the podcast in the past, but that sort of flexibility, the more amorphous nature of the additional information container in the application allows you to not potentially share that what grade it was in, and that allows you to sort of sneak in some potential extra accomplishments through the back door, so to speak, while still playing within the bounds of the application, because they don't ask you in the additional information section what grade or what years it occurred during or in. So you could certainly put this in there, especially if it's going to help the through line or the application, right? So if the student has anything pertaining to science, space, in particularly aerospace engineering, space policy, space writing, this would be a very relevant, and it's potentially sort of cool and niche. So this could definitely go in the application. So if it's going to reinforce your hook, what your main passion is, your main academic through line, then you can definitely put it in the additional information section to do so. I don't know exactly what the rarity is of this. This would be something we'd have to do a much more of a deep dive on, but it is sort of cool and interesting and potentially relevant. Okay, next extracurricular. Attends a STEM enrichment program since grade 7. This is a free program at a local top college. I've taken out the university name. Starting a Society of Women Engineers chapter at her high school. Volunteers and conducts STEM-based activities at the local children's museum. She completed 30 hours this past summer and is still involved once a month during the academic year. JV volleyball team, 9th and 10th grade. Rocketry course this past summer for free at a local city college. Plays the cello and is part of the Tri-M Music Honor Society, and is a member of the Society of Latino American Students Club at her school. She is a Latina student, and she's also part of the robotics club. And they noted here that robotics club does not do any competitions, though. So basically, now let's get into sort of the thematic reorganization of these extracurriculars. I've broken it down into 2 single disciplines. One of them is sort of a large umbrella. So the first discipline is going to be writing, right? And there's obviously related areas always. So writing, English, creative writing, etc. But I've just sort of labeled this as writing. The second category is going to be STEM. Now, obviously, there's many different fields in STEM. We're going to be talking about the student sort of representation a little bit. There's sort of this notion of sort of women in STEM or females in STEM, or females being more underrepresented. That's not true of all aspects of STEM, though. If you are planning on doing pre-med or biology or biochem, something relevant to a pre-med narrative, as a female, you're not necessarily underrepresented. It's about probably 50-50. It might even be 60-40-ish female to male. So just understand that if you're talking about physics or engineering, mathematical sciences, quantitative sciences, that skews a lot more predominantly towards males. And so females might have an edge from an admissions advantage, being more underrepresented in those areas of STEM, right? So it does depend what area or subdiscipline of STEM it is. That being said, I'm just sort of using the overall STEM umbrella here for some of the students' extracurriculars. Also, because some of them are not very hyper specific. There's not sort of the aerospace versus the mechanical versus etc. And some of them are just broadly STEM. So the second category here is going to be STEM, which is a bit of a larger discipline umbrella. So we have writing, we have STEM activities. Then the third category and the fourth are going to be more intersections. They might have some different themes as well that I've sort of identified, or sort of some sub themes. So the third category is going to be women in STEM or women plus STEM. And then the fourth category is going to be writing. and STEM. And you could also sort of frame that a little bit as maybe space communication, space writing, writing about space, or a science communicator, somebody who writes about science. The fifth category is just going to be Latinx, Latina, Latino, because they have an activity relevant to that. And then the last category is just going to be sort of miscellaneous, other, and that's just going to be like very typical, well-rounded cliche activities that pretty much every student has in their profile. Okay, so let's go through. So what do we have under the writing umbrella? So we have two. One of them isn't not really as much extracurricular. It's a little bit of a high school program. So the student's part of her school's English Scholars Program. And they put that she's a strong writer, but we don't really know exactly what that means. They have a bunch of writings. Are they working on a book, for example? So a little bit that's sort of in school. Some things that are in school, as I mentioned on the podcast, can sort of be branded as extracurriculars. So if you have a capstone project, some sort of research project in your school, independent study, these can be branded as extracurriculars and put into the activities list in your application. So just keep that in mind. Second, as noted before, so the student had some poetry that was published in 3 high school writers' publications as a ninth grader. So that's definitely good and off to a good start. So they have 2 bullets there under the writing umbrella. Then in terms of STEM, so they attend a STEM enrichment program, as mentioned, at a nearby, top college since grade 7. They had the rocketry course at a local city college they took this past summer, so that would have been ninth grade going to 10th grade. And then they are part of a robotics club that doesn't partake in any competitions. Also, sort of talking about sort of the strength of some of these, right? So having some even high school level writing publications as a ninth graders, off to a fairly, good start. It's not, Iowa Writers Program. It's not, being published in a major periodical or a major national, international level award. But early in high school, it's starting to definitely lay the foundation for, some relevant admissions positioning and resume and hooks. And then in terms of STEM, so the STEM enrichment program at a nearby college, that's nice. But if it just seems like more school, right? It's just like you're just taking more courses and more courses. This is what happens with a lot of students who do summer programs and why they're not particularly impressive. It's because it just looks a lot more like school. It just looks like an extension of school. Right? And so we talked about in some recent episodes, students who sort of are very over-indexed on just metrics. It's not really hitting the soft factors of an application or what these top colleges are really looking for beyond the metrics, which is students who are high agency, high initiative, they're doers, they make things happen in the real world. You just sitting in a classroom more is not really breaking the mold in any way. And it just looks a lot of like what you do during the school year. If you're doing research, for example, that doesn't look like what you do all day in school or during, the entire school year, right? It looks a lot different. It's a lot more applied. You can work on very niche and specific topics, right? You can, help create protocols and run the subjects and, run the studies and the testing and whatnot. You can innovate protocols. It's much more fluid, which is a setting that is much more conducive to high agency and also to very niche and specific topics. And specificity is one of the ways that your candidacy can actually stand out because the more specific your candidacy is, the less likely it's going to overlap with those candidacies of other students, right? And sound the same as every other application. So just being part of a STEM enrichment program without sort of any, real impact or contributions or research projects or measurable impact or outputs is not super impressive. Then taking a rocketry course, again, that's cool. It's intellectual vitality. It could be relevant to the narrative here. And it is okay in some of the younger grades or even late middle school. I wouldn't even say it's okay. It's ideal, particularly for students who are still in middle school, to start laying the foundations for that skill set and that hook that you're trying to build, right? So you can be taking courses. You don't want to confuse those courses with very high value standout extracurriculars because that would be a mistake because then you might think you're in a different position. You might think your candidacy stands in a better place than it actually does. But as long as you understand that those are not major differentiators, but they are helping you to lay the groundwork, the base of skills, the foundation of skills, the initial exposure to the field, that's okay, right? if you're 11th grade and you're still taking courses outside school and just getting the 101, 201 levels of your field, and then expect that you're going to be competitive for top colleges, then you have a very big issue. So it's understanding what is age appropriate and what's not sort of age appropriate when you are talking about applying to the most competitive colleges. The standards are obviously much higher. So taking a rocketry course is sort of laying just groundwork. These aren't differentiating activities, but they're laying sort of just the basic foundation of intellectual vitality and skill set in some of these fields. And then we have robotics club. We've talked about this on past episodes. Super common, borderline cliche activity for any students who are interested in STEM. It's just, you just have a ton of different robotics clubs and many different students who are interested in engineering and STEM who are in robotics. So again, it's relevant if you're getting some skills from it, unless you're going to really do something with it. And it's going to have, again, if there are going to be competitions and you can see measurable impact or you have leadership, even that for STEM students, and engineering students, just a dime a dozen. If you're really just, there's no competitions going on, you're just a member in the robotics club, you really have to sort of understand that it's not a major ROI. And so if it's not a major ROI, but it's still a little bit relevant. It's giving you maybe a little bit of value, but you would want to make sure the time sort of matches the value so that you don't end up with a big disparity there, right? You don't want sort of a very low value activity taking up major amounts of your time, which is why we talk about sports a lot, are very bad from an ROI perspective when it comes to top and highly selected colleges, unless you're a recruited athlete, because they're very large time commitments that return you very low value for your time. Then we have some intersection themes that I've sort of pulled out here. So she's a Girl Scout. She has a silver and working on her gold award. That won't be impressive in and of itself. But if there were some women or sort of some female themes in a student's application, if they were positioning for gender studies or part of their narrative or their interests or their passions were related to, women in STEM, then that Girl Scout could potentially be made relevant. Outside of that, it's just sort of a common, well-rounded activity. And then we mentioned the Girl Leadership Committee, on that local county council of Girl Scouts. She won the short writing contest as a Girl Scout with the sort of the NASA mission to the moon. So she has that there. That is both the women, the female theme, the Girl Scout theme, plus the STEM or sort of the NASA and the space theme. And then you have the that she's starting a Society of Women Engineers chapter at her high school. And so again, that is an intersection of both the female, the women, the gender theme, plus the STEM or the engineering theme. We have that as well. Now, the fourth category we have is also an intersection and sort of interdisciplinary here. And this would be writing or any sort of communication angle plus STEM. We could also call this sort of a science communicator theme. So for that, she had the writing contest with the space science girl for the NASA mission. She volunteered and conducts STEM-based activities at the local children's museum. 30 hours this past summer going to 10th grade, and then she is still involved once a month during the academic year. What I will say there is also with the Society of Women Engineers, she's just getting it going, right? So it's very fledgling. Obviously, you have to build it up to be able to make, a greater impact, etc. The writing contest did occur in middle school, so it's something that has the right idea in terms of themes, but it can't go in the honor section or the activity section of the applications, the main sections. I really like the potential theme. I think it's very cool. And it does seem like a very nice encapsulation of this student's different interest. But it did occur during middle school. So we do have to kind of take that into account. So we might be looking for similar activities like this going forward, but actually in high school. And then in terms of the volunteership, this is also very cool in terms of some STEM-based activities at the local children's museum. This is something where, 30 hours over the summer. So if we say, summer's maybe, let's say, 8 weeks or something, it's probably more like 10 weeks, 12 weeks. Let's just call it 10 to keep the numbers round. It's about 3 hours a week. It's not super substantial. It's okay. And then once a month during the academic year, it could be okay. It just depends on what we're trying to do with it, right? If this becomes an activity where we want to really scale this and put a lot more horsepower behind it, and there's the opportunity for that, like there's a high ceiling, the first thing we have to do is figure out the strategy, right? Before we figure out what sort of baskets we're putting our eggs in. If the student didn't really like this science communicator theme, it wasn't really what they're the most passionate about, and what they actually were really passionate about was sort of the women in engineering or getting much more specific with aerospace engineering activities, et cetera, then we may not go in this direction. It just depends on the student, and this is why you have to ultimately talk to the student and get, both, actual dynamic answers. And then what we typically do in our discovery process is we give them a whole bunch of questions, longer form questions, and sort of really flesh out these things a lot more because currently we're just working with like single lines that are just like resume bullets. But we don't have a lot of context, right? And so when a student talks a lot more, you have a much greater insight into what the recurring themes are that they talk about a lot, how much depth they can go into when they talk about them. And then you can really start doing common factors analyses and you really see where their strengths and their passions sort of really lie. Just looking at lines on a resume or in a background, it serves as a first shot at what some of the themes are and the possible directions and the strategic avenues. But it's very fledgling and superficial and preliminary, right? So we're doing mostly high level analyses in these episodes currently, because otherwise you would have to really talk to the student. They would have to answer 30 questions, full form essay questions, and it becomes a much more deep dive discovery process at that point. It really depends on what the students' interests are, what they're more passionate in, where their strengths sort of lie, and that should be evidence based. If the student really did like this science communicator theme as a possibly very cool bridge between their science and engineering interests, but also their writing skill sets. And we always want to try to pick filters that I say in the podcast subsume the greatest amount of value in the student's candidacy. But you could also say subsume the greatest amount of their passions or subsume the greatest amount of their skill sets or their strengths, right? And so if we created a narrative that doesn't include any of the students' writing strengths or passions, we're leaving out a good amount of that if we don't, include any of maybe the engineering or some of the female themes, or you're potentially leaving out some passions, some skill sets, some strengths, and some value from the student's candidacy. It doesn't mean that you are going to pick a filter, going to be able to pick a filter that subsumes 100% of the value or the skill sets or the strengths or the passions, but you want to sort of get the greatest percentage that you can. So this would sort of depend on what the narrative is going to be. It could be the case that we would want to allocate and do a lot more in this children's museum activity, and sort of make that a very promising channel if we were going to do the science communicator theme. If we weren't building the whole candidacy around being sort of the science communicator, then that might be just an offshoot theme of the student's candidacy, sort of a side hook, right? A secondary or tertiary theme of their positioning. If that's not as promising and it becomes more marginalized, then it might be okay with the current time commit, right? It's sort of something you do once a month and it's sort of relevant to some of the STEM, it's relevant to maybe some of the communication and the writing, but it's not maybe one of our main vehicles. But if it did become a lot more of the prominent theme, then we might really want to put more eggs in that basket and really scale it up a lot more, right? So we go to sort of the museum administrators. We sort of say, hey, I like doing this thing. Could we take this a bit to the next level? You want to invest more hours in it. You would want to do more things with it to sort of take charge and sort of take it to the next level, right? If that's going to be one of your main opportunity vehicles, because it's one of the more relevant vehicles. But that only comes after we've decided the strategy first. In terms of some other themes, so they have the Latinx theme, so member of the Society of Latino American Students Club at her school. She's a Latino student. So she is both an underrepresented minority in college admissions, which matters. And then when it comes to engineering, particularly fields like mechanical engineering, she is going to be underrepresented as a female. So those are things that you have to take into account strategically as well. And so it really is a large heterogeneous mix of a bunch of different factors, right? It's what are the students' primary strengths? What are their primary interests and passions? What are the strategic factors involved here? The student's sort of in a nice position where writing is not a super common, or creative writing or English is not an oversubscribed major like engineering is. And then for engineering, well, she's she's female, so she's underrepresented in engineering as well, right? She's not sort of she's not a male, she's not an Asian Indian male, which is sort of be the total opposite end of the spectrum in terms of being highly, highly overrepresented. She does have some nice positioning here, given some of the background, right? And so we have to take all the strategic factors. We have to take the passions, we have to take the strengths, we have to take the current evidence. We have to look for potential connections or intersections of the interests. Sort of how do we sort of combine these and nexus points? We have to look at the strategic factors, the demographic factors, the representation. We have to sort of see the end before we sort of start making very tactical decisions. And we have to see how this all sort of comes together. Then you have to look at things like strategic risk, which is basically, how unique is this, et cetera. Those are sort of more the representation factors and the disciplines and, what is the exact niche theme? Where is that going to be, especially weighed against the student's potential goals? And then you have to look at executional factors, which is basically what's the executional risk, right? What are the opportunities in this field? How hard is it to build a narrative in this field or in this niche? What's the student's particular skill set? Are they more of the thinker? Are they more of the doer? They have more of the hard technical skills? Do they have more of the soft skills, maybe lacking some of the technical, et cetera, right? It's really a lot of variables that have to go into the analysis before you then basically lay out the strategic path or paths going forward. And then after that, you return to the specific tactics, basically. Again, underrepresented minority students when applying to the top colleges, and she would be underrepresented as a female in engineering. In terms of some other activities, so JV volleyball, ninth and 10th grade, and then plays the cello as part of the Tri-Am Music Honor Society. Very, very common, right? So these are the very classic, well-rounded activities. So these won't figure very prominently in our analysis. That being said, we've taken all of her extracurriculars, we sort of recategorize them, and there are different directions here, right? So if she really loves the intersection of writing and STEM, and maybe even more specific than that, not just STEM, because some of her activities are just STEM, right? The STEM enrichment program, it depends on what she's doing there. The rocketry course is obviously more specific. The robotics club, a little bit more specific. It really depends on what exactly the students' passions are, what their strengths are. But if she wanted to go sort of the science communicator route, she could start investing, like bringing up that writing skill set, but then also writing about science topics. So we've had students who are on the school newspaper, and that's not a particularly standout activity in and of itself because it's fairly common, particularly for students who are interested in writing. But we've had students who sort of create, sort of science research columns or science communication related vehicles for the newspaper. So that's one sort of idea. And so there's one angle which could be just basically bolstering up the writing and just getting more impact, better programs. But if you're going to try to be the science communicator, then you want to have activities that also are nexus activities or that are interdisciplinary in nature. They have both in the same activity. They have both the STEM and they have the writing. So you would want some potential intersection activities there, more writing activities, more awards, competitions. If this is going to be a major part of your candidacy, then you might consider an internship. There are science magazines and science publications, right? Or you do anything related to that science communicator theme. Like I said, she already has an activity, the local children's museum. You can just do more and do that better, right? You don't need new. You probably still want to have some new activities as well that are going to be high value, but you also have current pre-existing vehicles that you can just add more to, right? More and better instead of new. In terms of STEM, what I would say for the student, particularly because it sounds like, or at least the stated goal was top engineering programs, she needs a lot more technical prowess. So she has potentially very cool themes. And this is sort of, I've used this sort of juxtaposition, the logical components or sort of the depth components or the talent components versus the sort of emotional components, the cool factor, the weird activities, the niche, interdisciplinary activities, or sort of the breadth, right? It's like you're intersecting AI plus museum art. Doing the science communicator theme would definitely give some emotional appeal, some interdisciplinarity. It'd be some cool stories. It's unexpected because it's just more rare. It's sort of a juxtaposition of disciplines, but she does need better technical, I would say, exposition here. She needs to really bolster up some of the technical skill set. And that's going to be on the STEM side. That's going to be things like more competitive programs in STEM, potentially summer programs, programs that are harder to get into. She doesn't need any more of what students typically do, which is she doesn't need more courses, right? She's already in a STEM enrichment program. She's already taken a rocketry course. Doing a very common summer program or just taking more courses outside of school is doing nothing to improve her candidacy. So she needs to step it up, which means much more competitive, more rigorous STEM programs, things that are like competitions. Since she's in a robotics club, there's no competitions, there's no benchmarking here. More competitive programs, possibly summer programs, but more competitive ones, not just taking more courses, science research in relevant fields that are, relevant to her interest, right? So if it's aerospace engineering, mechanical engineering, science research, right? Science research positions. You have things that are more the logical components, the logical benchmarking, the technical elements, basically, right? That's going to be research, very competitive programs, competitions, maybe impressive internships, right? With, engineering firms or whatever is basically that would be more rigorous and more technical to sort of lay the more logical, technical, measurable parts of that skill set, right? That needs to be laid down, particularly if she is going to be applying for engineering. Now, the difficulties with engineering, and I've sort of mentioned this with business, but engineering has a lot of the same strategic complexities. It really depends what college you're talking about in terms of what engineering looks like and how you apply to engineering. Is there a different school undergraduate? Is it a different admissions committee that has faculty that sits on the committee? What does that review process look like? Do you have to be directly admitted to engineering? Is it sort of you just applied to all of the majors and all the majors sort of collapsed and you just apply in? Engineering, like business, has a lot of strategic positioning complexities, and that would be another piece of the puzzle. And unfortunately, I can't really comment on that too much because there's just too many degrees of freedom currently. You'd have to talk to them, first of all, much more dynamically. You would have to sort of dive into all these different themes. You'd have to expose them to some of the intersections. And it becomes a lot more dynamic and longer form discovery process. And then you have to sort of understand in terms of what some of the goals are. Are their goals sort of the best overall college? Are their goals the best engineering program? In this student's particular case, it sounds like there's some financial considerations, which unfortunately do make things a lot more complex because then you have an extra constraint or another variable on top of that. You really sort of have to sort of take it a step at a time. This is a good like first shot to sort of reorganize some of the sort of mess and pull out some of the specific themes, but there's a lot more work to sort of be done strategically in terms of the paths, going forward. And you have to be able to see the end before you start, which means you need to understand the late stage strategic positioning parts of the process, how you would actually apply to those colleges for engineering. Is this sort of just all the majors in one bucket? Because you would build your candidacy in different ways accordingly, or you might. It depends. There's a lot of different strategic positioning factors, particularly when talking about some pre-professional areas like engineering and business. If it's pre-med or pre-law, it's much more flexible because you're just going to arts and sciences regardless. And so you can choose between a whole bunch of different majors and you have a lot more positioning flexibility. That would also have to sort of play in. But as soon as it's very serious about STEM and mechanical or aerospace engineering, she needs to really beef up the technical parts of her application. And as I said in these episodes, I said in earlier episodes, all these different students in these different cases, they have different issues, right? And so it's sort of like playing whack-a-mole. There's a student who's sort of extremely over indexed on all the talents, technical capabilities, and they're doing all the competitions and the awards and all the measurable stuff. And they really lack the emotional components or the interest factor, the wow factor, the really cool themes or the niche themes. And then there are other students who have some potentially very cool, intersections or niches or passions. They have really great soft skills, but they don't necessarily have the really like hardcore technical proficiency as some of the other students do. Again, as I've mentioned many times, it's not an either or. If you want to give yourself the greatest probability of success in this process, you need to acquire the greatest number of skills. Right. And so a lot of people view this as sort of, they don't like it because you're pointing out their deficiencies. Right. So there's the introverted, very high IQ, very cerebral, for lack of a better term, sort of nerdy STEM kid, you have to point out and say, hey, like you need some more high agency doer, leadership, etc. Right? You need more emotional appeal, right? You can't just sit in front of your computer all the time in a dark basement. You need to actually interface with more humans, and you need some of these other aspects that build a really exceptional candidacy, right? And then there are other students who are doers and they're more interpersonal and they're more charismatic and they're more extroverted and they can lead the club, but they're sort of allergic to doing science research, right? And we talk about this a lot with business kids, right? They're like, ugh, yuck, research. But that is a very important part of the evaluation process at highly selective colleges is intellectual vitality. If your goal is to be maximally competitive for these colleges, you need to understand what your strengths are and you need to get maximum leverage out of your strengths, right? You don't want to neglect your strengths because that would be really dumb strategically. You don't want to take all your time away from your strengths and then put it into all of your weaknesses. That's really strategically unwise and not advised. But what you do want to do is say, here are my strengths. I'm going to get max bang for my buck and max leverage out of my strengths and play to them as much as I can. But there are some other factors here, some other things that are weaknesses, and I do need to sort of address those as well. For the student, has some potentially very cool, interesting themes, does need some more technical proficiency on top of potentially better building out some of the potential very cool interdisciplinary themes if that's what they're interested in. So we talked about that. If they're interested in sort of the women, female, the STEM angle, then that might be where they put more of, sort of their cards. They are starting a club. We certainly look at students' words, but the best handicap is their actions. And that's the only thing. Well, I wouldn't say it's the only thing. They do have your words in the application, right? But the strongest signal and the best honest signal is what you've done, right? Actions speak louder than words. So it is very notable that the student, is starting the Society of Women Engineers. And so if that's more their interest, maybe they just go, sort of all in and start trying to build up the technical parts of their application and the STEM and the aerospace engineering or the mechanical engineering. And maybe that becomes, a large part. And then maybe the remaining 25% becomes sort of the intersection of STEM engineering. It could be more specific, like it could be female astronauts. It could be more specific. It depends. Again, this is sort of where you need to do a lot longer form and more thorough of analysis, but it could go in some of those directions as well if that's what they're potentially interested in. It could go in several different directions, right? You also have the sort of Latina theme, right? That's not intersected. That was just sort of more, sort of an identity or a background, which will be important for the student to have in their application since post affirmative action, you can't sort of just check a box. You need to have activities that speak to that underrepresented minority background or to bring it up in your essays. But you really need to build activities that basically would allow the colleges to identify and to sort of view that through a more sort of holistic lens, not just sort of a checkbox item, since that's banned by by the Supreme Court and by law. You cannot be given an advantage just by virtue of your racial ethnic background. You have to sort of be bringing something to the college community that could be supported. So if you've done something in your extracurriculars, or you could talk about this in your essay or how you would contribute to the college community in some way that's more of a holistic, sort of substantiated contribution by way of your sort of unique background. So it's good the student does have some actual activities in terms of that, right? But we have a whole bunch of different themes here in terms of, again, the writing in the STEM, the women in the STEM. It just sort of depends in terms of what the student, again, is passionate about, where their strengths sort of lie. You move forward from there. That is it for this analysis. Again, if you are a younger student or have a younger student, you want us to do a case study analysis, or if you are a senior or have a senior and you want us to take a look your application after the decisions come out, you can shoot us an email, info@greatmindsadvising.com, and we'll let you know if we can cover it on a future episode. And that is it for this one. Hopefully, this is helpful to everyone, and we'll talk soon in the next episode. Bye bye.